The poem Remains is a dramatic monologue, which means we hear the voice of a single person, mono, and that person is not the voice of the poet, but the poet taking on the role of someone else, like a piece of drama. In this case, Armitage is taking on the role of a soldier who's returned home from a conflict zone. The poem begins like it's in the middle of something. It begins with "on another occasion," as if what is about to be revealed is just the next in a sequence of admissions or confidences that the speaker is sharing. Now, Armitage spent time interviewing veterans who'd returned from a range of conflicts, and this particular poem is part of that collection, a collection of poems called The Not Dead. And Armitage himself wrote that these are poems of survivors, the damaged, exhausted men who return from war in body but never wholly in mind. And the fact that the poem that we're going to read has the feel of an interview, like a longer response to a question from which this is a fragment, is completely consistent with the way that Armitage himself gathered the information for this collection. On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire, three of a kind, all letting fly. And I swear, I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into the body, and then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story. Except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed, possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here, in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. So the narrative of this poem is fairly straightforward. A soldier in some post-conflict territory sees some robbers raiding a bank. He's not sure whether they're armed or not, so him and the two guys he is with all start shooting. The robber is killed, and the speaker feels that this should be an end of the matter. He's done his job, except that every time he's out on patrol, he walks past the scene of the incident and sees the bloodstain where the man died. And even when he's back home, he's unable to stop thinking about it. So the title, Remains, refers both to the dead body of the bank robber and to the guilt-ridden memory of the soldier who killed him. You can notice straight away the sort of chatty, conversational style that the poet is using here. First of all, there are these colloquialisms, which are these informal phrases like legs it up the road, or letting fly, or mates, or carted off. We've also got contractions, which is where two words have become one with an apostrophe in place of any missing letters, like we've and he's. And finally, another feature of spoken language present in these four stanzas are these fillers, which appear in a couple of the sentences, like here, well, so, sort of. And these fillers are a device which we all use in spoken language to give our brains a bit of thinking time before saying the next thing. And this may be being used to suggest that the soldier is finding these details troubling and difficult to speak about. Despite the clarity of some parts of this memory, there are also details which are vague and less well defined, such as who he was with at the time of the shooting, which is just brushed away as somebody else and somebody else. There is also uncertainty surrounding whether the robbers were armed or not. Probably armed, possibly not. And this points to a number of important ideas in this poem. Firstly, the pace that decisions have to be made when you're in a highly stressful conflict situation, such as whether to shoot someone or not. And secondly, that these decisions remain with the soldiers, and we can see that because the same phrase, probably armed, possibly not, is repeated in the second part of the poem as well, on line 22. And this leads me on nicely to a point about the structure and organisation of this poem, which is in two quite clear halves, with the first half being about the circumstances which led to the looter being killed, and a quite graphic description of his death, with the second half focusing on the lasting psychological impact of this event. The description of the shooting is deliberately graphic because we are meant to see it as the soldier did in order to understand his feelings afterwards. In line 9, Armitage uses alliteration to connect these two words, round and rip. And these, together with the long vowel sound of each word, helps to suggest the sound of prolonged gunfire. Now, my interpretation of line 10, I see broad daylight on the other side, is that this is a piece of deliberate exaggeration or hyperbole. I mean, presumably there isn't a hole in the looter's body which the soldier can literally see through, but it's used to emphasise the amount of violence done to him. And I mentioned before the use of this colloquial phrase here, carted off, to describe what happens to the man's body. It literally means to be taken away, but the expression Armitage chooses makes the action seem careless and undignified, in the same way that one of the soldiers tosses his guts back into his body. There's a really interesting contrast in the way the voice of the soldier expresses himself in this section. In line 12, he seems unsure and perhaps unable to describe what he's seeing, and relies on sort of inside out, in the way that a young inarticulate soldier might. But in the next line, which begins stanza 4, the soldier suddenly becomes much more poetic, as if the horror of what he has seen releases the voice of his conscience. The soldier has been dehumanized and has become pain itself, the image of agony, and this is what will continue to haunt the soldier afterwards. Stanza 5 begins with an internal half-rhyme where end of story suggests the end of a sequence of events, while except not really lets us know that in fact the story of the soldier has only just begun. And there's a note of surprise in the tone of this line which indicates that he was totally unprepared for the lasting impact this event has on his psychology. The soldier develops a condition called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, brought on by the shooting and the lingering uncertainty surrounding whether the looter was really armed or not, whether he really posed a threat to the soldier's life. Just as the first half of the poem is largely concerned with outward events in this conflict zone, so the second half is mostly internalised and is thematically concerned with the mental state of the soldier. The lines used to express these feelings become increasingly poetic and metaphoric, starting with "his blood shadow stays on the street," which combines the metaphor of something permanent which won't go away, in other words his memory, with the sibilance of stays street, creating a sort of sinister and bitter tone. The short sentence, "then I'm home on leave," stands out in this part of the poem because it's so matter-of-fact and spoken in the same plain English as the first 4 stanzas. What is ambiguous, however, is whether the soldier was sent home because of his developing PTSD or because he was due to go home on leave anyway. The full stop in the middle of a line of poetry, like here, is called a caesura, and it's used to separate the soldier's time abroad from the time when he's back home. And the first thing he tells us about this time is punctuated with these plosive B sounds: but, blink, bursts, bank, which further add to the quite desperate tone of this part of the poem. And there are lines here which are structured in such a way as to emphasise the verb, which seems to take us further and further into his unconscious mind, first with blink, then sleep, then dream. And it seems to indicate the ever-present nature of the memories. Like, it doesn't matter how short or long his eyes are closed for, the events still play over and over again in his mind. And here we've got the repetition of the probably, possibly line which I mentioned before, which pretty clearly indicates this uncertainty is the main driving force behind his trauma. The verb torn here is particularly graphic again, describing the injuries the robber sustained, and the fact that this detail is juxtaposed with the soldier's attempt to self-medicate using drink and drugs tells us how badly he's being affected by it. There are a few examples in this part of the poem of military language. The expression here, to flush him out, means to try and stop someone from hiding, to expose an enemy, while dug in indicates the stubborn removal to be removed, and behind enemy lines is an area of ground controlled by the enemy. And the whole sense, when you put this together, seems to suggest that this traumatic memory has taken over and controls his mind, and it is so well entrenched that not even alcohol or medication can remove it. The deliberately elongated line 27 is full of the same sibilant sounds as I mentioned before, not left for dead in some distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered land. And this continues to suggest a narrator who's becoming increasingly desperate, bitter and angry perhaps at the decision that he took to open fire in the first place, and perhaps at his own inability to deal with the consequences of that decision. The adjectival phrases of sun-stunned and sand-smothered give us some more clues about the topography of the war zone where these events took place. But Armitage also uses them to hint at the conflict and oppression which the population may be experiencing. And moreover, he says that the dead man's body has not remained in this distant location, but it's far more present. It is here and now. When we look at this piece of alliteration, which I've just indicated here, near to the knuckle, I always ask my classes to make a fist so they can see the bone through this thin layer of skin. And Armitage is saying that this is how close to the surface these memories are all the time. It's also helpful to imagine the soldier's clenched fist as he continues to experience the horrifying flashbacks brought on by this post-traumatic stress. The final image in this poem, His Bloody Life in My Bloody Hands, is as much literal as it is metaphorical. In our minds, we might imagine the soldier holding the dying bank robber, which is certainly a more tender image than the one presented before of one of his mates tossing his guts back into his body. The looter would be covered in blood, and of course consequently so would the soldier. But the line is also to do with guilt and responsibility. You might have heard the expression to have blood on your hands, which means to be guilty or responsible for something. Think of Pontius Pilate, who washed his hands in front of the baying crowd and metaphorically washed the guilt from them. Or Macbeth, who returned from the killing of King Duncan, his hands covered in blood, and says, "Will all great Neptune's oceans wash this blood clean from my hands?" In other words, he feels he will never be able to escape the guilt for the crime he's committed. The soldier in this poem is afflicted with these debilitating feelings of guilt, and this creates a conflict within his own mind between the need and the desire to protect the indigenous population of a war-affected country through quick decision-making, and yet still having to live with the consequences of those decisions.